Before we get started, I have a quick favor. I've been self-funding the Finding Genius podcast for 5 years now. I've done over 3,000 episodes. And as you can see on YouTube, we're up over 1 million views on the channel, which is fantastic. The next thing I really want to push on is to get up to 10,000 subscribers. Because once we do, we'll be able to put a donate button and we'll be able to solicit donations to help keep the podcast running and to also get the Finding Genius Foundation moving along. We have a big project studying anxiety, depression, and PTSD and working on a product to help people overcome these problems because I've seen them explode recently after the last 2 years of the whole virus situation. So if you would, please subscribe to the podcast. That would help us tremendously. Give us a thumbs up and check in the description for Buy Me a Coffee. It's about $5. If you could buy me a coffee, I'd really appreciate it. It would help keep the channel going, and I love coffee. Thank you.
Forget frequently asked questions,
common sense, common knowledge, or Google.
How about advice from a real genius? 95% of people in any profession are good enough to be qualified and licensed. 5%
go above and beyond.
They become very good at what they do, but only
0.1%
are real geniuses. Richard Jacobs has made it his life's mission to find them for you. He hunts down and interviews geniuses in every field: sleep science, cancer, stem cells, ketogenic diets, and more. Here come the geniuses. This is the Finding Genius Podcast
with Richard Jacobs.
Hello, this is Richard Jacobs with the Finding Genius Podcast. My guest today is Nathaniel Mead. He's been here before, well informed about all issues related to COVID, public health, vaccines, etc. So I'm having him back now because, as everyone knows, we have a new administration. Not only do we have Trump as president, but we have RFK Jr. as head of Health and Human Services. So it looks like there's quite a bit of change going on. And for most folks, it's probably below the surface. They don't realize what's happening, but Nathaniel's going to explain it. And he's also going to talk about a recent visit to the U.S. Senate, a hearing that was Dr. Peter McCullough spoke at, that he was present at, the reference paper that he was involved in. So it should be an excellent call and an update for folks who are wondering what's going on about vaccines and public health. So welcome, Nathaniel. Thanks for coming.
Thank you very much, Rich. Great to be here again. Thank you.
Yeah, let's talk first about the Senate hearing. What was the whole purpose of the hearing, and what was some of the testimony from Dr. Peter McCullough about?
Yeah, so this was a U.S. Senate hearing on the corruption of science and federal health agencies that it was hosted by or overseen by Senator Ron Johnson, who's been an amazing force for public health in the past 5 years, and especially in terms of the COVID-19 story and how it's been suppressed and distorted and kept, the truths have been kept from the public. And part of the reason that people don't even know about this, and I almost get the sense that you didn't even hear about it, is that the mainstream media did not report on this at all, even though we had seven medical experts on the panel. And these are people who are, very, very much at the top of their field, very important figures. So what's been unfolding in the public health domain, is a lot of concealment of facts. In the research domain, we've seen the CDC and the FDA withholding facts from the public, and that's all well documented. And a lot of that came through in this hearing because these agencies were captured by the pharmaceutical industry. And I was invited by Dr. Peter McCullough to join him at the meeting. He was the first testimony. So I sat behind him with John Leake and Nicholas Hulsher, who are also on the McCullough Foundation staff. I'm also a part of the McCullough Foundation as a scholar. So we listened to Dr. McCullough give an outstanding testimony. But none of this was reported by the mainstream media. The New York Times, Washington Post, CSNBC, CNN, NPR, nobody reported this Senate hearing. And, when I think about just the media being a voice that's supposed to be objective and it's supposed to be reporting especially important events like this. And the fact that it was completely censored by the legacy media, that just tells you how much control the pharmaceutical industry has over important news events like this. I mean, this was extremely important for people to know about. And but then I think about where we're at right now, and I'm really not surprised because here it is, the summer of 2025. Apparently the pandemic ended what?
It ended the day Russia invaded Ukraine, by the way.
Okay.
No, I'm not kidding. The day before, it was still the same COVID. The day after, it magically disappeared. Nothing was mentioned.
Okay, so and that was in 2023, right? Or
Stars on to February 2022, yeah.
2022. Okay. So, but bizarre as it sounds, the current COVID-19 mRNA product from Pfizer and Moderna are still under emergency use authorization for all kids in America up to 11 years of age. So, all kids in the United States up to 11 years of age are still under the emergency use authorization for these so-called vaccines from Pfizer and Moderna. And, so why is that bizarre? Well, by definition, the emergency use authorization is supposed to be given under public health emergencies, right? So when the benefits are shown to outweigh the risks and when there's no effective alternative. And so, but we know that there are huge problems with this because, first of all, the risk-benefit clinical trials were never even done for kids. So, what's the basis for even including them in this? And then second, we've known that kids have a 0.003% or basically zero chance of dying from COVID-19 as of 2022. As of 2022, they basically had a zero chance of dying from COVID-19. So where's the emergency, for these young kids, for these young people, and really for anyone for that matter? I mean, there is, even in the elderly, there is no emergency with COVID-19. So there is, the fact that the kids are still under EAU is very strange. And one of the things that you and I were talking about just before the show was that this coincides with RFK Jr. doing some things that were actually helping to counteract this with kids. But I think this is a complicated situation, and I'd really love to talk a little bit about what Robert F. Kennedy Jr., his becoming the Secretary of Health and Human Services, how important that is.
Sure, we'll get to that in a second. Yeah. I'm going to give you a quick perspective. You're at all science on a day-to-day basis and at a high level, but me being more like a member of the public. Yeah. So what I've seen from people, it's like, oh, we were told to do X, Y, Z, don't question it. And then the guy didn't stop and no one really talks about it. And if you bring it up now, it's like, oh, well, that's over. We need to move on. And that's really, I guess, the summation of, I would say, the public's knowledge and thought about it. It's like, it wasn't a good time. I don't want to think about it. And it kind of ends there. And I think that's why people don't have maybe much interest in following up on what happened and everything,
That's a really good point. And I can totally understand that. I think it's a very uncomfortable thing, especially for those who receive these injections, to hear anything negative in terms of the long-term adverse effects that we're seeing with these things, which is what I've been working on and publishing. And so it's a very uncomfortable reality that many people are facing, knowing people who have been injured, but also knowing that their risk of certain things, certain diseases and disabilities may be substantial. And that's what's coming out in the research, and that's what's been suppressed, and what we talked about at the U.S. Senate hearing. So yeah, it's a strange time, but I think I believe that most people are interested in a healthier nation, both physically and mentally. And so what we're talking about is directly relevant to, health on a large scale. And what transpired over the past 5 years in terms of things that you and I have talked about in the past, like agency capture, corporate corruption, suppression of free speech. We talked about the retraction of papers or one paper that I wrote that was a very important paper. So in that context, it's very important to understand why the current conversation around COVID-19 is still so incredibly important, because it actually relates to things that we cherish in a democratic society, like free speech, manifesting through open scientific discourse, which a lot of people consider to be one of the purest forms of objective speech. You're trying to base it on facts and on observations and clinical testing and things like that. So why would you want to suppress the facts that you are revealing through well-designed studies? And why would you want to suppress the facts that about studies that were designed to show misleading conclusions. So these are all things that are really important. And I think Robert F. Kennedy, anyone who understands the magnitude of the public health issues that we faced in the past 5 years has to be ecstatic about his becoming Secretary of Health and Human Services. I mean, this is going to sound political for a moment, but we were in deep trouble under the Biden administration, and Kamala Harris had vowed to follow Biden's policies to a T. So it would have been, if we had continued, it would have been a nightmare. And I say this as a lifelong Democrat from a family that always voted on the blue ticket. I grew up in Massachusetts. I voted for Obama. And of course, I voted for Biden the first time around because I was a Democrat. And then when I saw what the Biden-Harris administration did in terms of shutting down free speech, especially for scientists and healthcare professionals, and then sending tens of billions in direct military aid to Israel's, slaughter of the Palestinians, and then the Russian-Ukraine conflict, the sending tens of billions there, I no longer recognized the Democratic Party that I had grown up with. And, Bobby Kennedy has talked about it in a very similar way. I highly recommend his book. I'm trying to remember. I think it's called American Values or something like that. But he talks about, all of this. And then his letter to liberals is another great little book that he wrote that explains how people were deceived over the past 5 years. So we've seen a lot of major changes thanks to his becoming secretary. And I had the great honor of speaking with him on the phone for 33 minutes back in early 2023. He's one of the most scientifically literate individuals you'll ever find who does not have a PhD. He's really brilliant. He also has, I think, tremendous compassion, when it comes to issues around personal growth and healing, because he's in his own personal life, he went through incredible hardship, the murder of his father and his uncle, and, what followed for him as a young man, which I'm not going to go into. But in the past 4 months, I would say Kennedy, the first thing that he accomplished, which I think is incredibly important based on what I just talked about at the opening of this conversation, is that he removed the COVID mRNA shots from the childhood vaccine schedule. And I can explain the implications of that from the standpoint of safety if you want, or did you want to make a comment?
All right, go ahead. Yes, some more clarification will be good.
Yeah. So when you remove the COVID shots, we could talk, I think we should call them COVID shots, because we talk about flu shots. So I'll simply refer to these mRNA vaccines as COVID shots. But anyway, removing them from the childhood vaccine schedule due to serious safety concerns, which have been widely published, cardiac problems, problems with the heart, brain, all these neurological problems, autoimmune problems, hematological clotting problems, and so forth. Removing them from the schedule can translate into some major benefits for the public. And I think, first, of course, you're prioritizing the safety of children. So you're reducing the risk of all kinds of adverse effects. One that we're going to talk about in a moment, because the paper I just had published, is myocarditis, which is damage and inflammation of the heart muscle. And then you've got childhood lymphomas that were linked to these shots. Serious.
What ages do they come up at?
For kids, typically these are kids in their teens who are developing these lymphomas. And we think that a key part of that is a combination of removing the brakes on the lymphomas, like the tumor suppressor genes that are typically involved in keeping the brakes on the growth of those, and at the same time activating the Epstein-Barr virus, which is so common in children. And then there's other factors, but there are DNA contaminants in there that could be explaining the cancers as well. And then you've got a whole range of neurological complications that are affecting these kids, like seizures and strokes, Bell's palsy, which is facial paralysis, the Guillain-Barré syndrome, which is also, typically a very rare thing, but it's shown up a lot in the last 5 years. It's a horrible disorder where the body's immune system attacks the nerves and, causes muscle weakness and paralysis, sometimes paralysis. And, it causes tingling in the hands and feet, and it can result in a great deal of pain, as well as, difficulty breathing and swallowing. So this is a disabling nightmare, and it's happened to kids who were perfectly healthy before the COVID shots.
And what do you think is the overall, I mean, it's based on general, but the overall mechanism from, being an armchair scientist, the injection of this spike protein in the body, making so much of it would cause, I guess, just a continual ongoing irritation and put the body in a state where it's, again, it's perceived that it's being attacked and it doesn't go away. And so it tries to adapt, and the adaptive mechanism changes when, the first 1, 2, 3 don't work. And then it leads to this dysfunction, these lymphomas and these other problems. I would guess it causes epigenetic change that eventually leads to malignancy. That's just my speculation.
Yeah. Oh, so you're talking specifically in terms of cancer, or just the wide range that we're talking?
Why children would get lymphomas, for instance?
Yeah. Well, I mean, there's a lot of aspects to this. These shots, when they're, especially when you get more than, say, 2 shots, you have the potential for ongoing spike production at a pretty rapid clip. And that spike protein is itself inflammatory. And so when you combine that with the inflammatory effects of the lipid nanoparticles that carry it to all parts of the body, including the brain and into the nervous system and into the bone marrow and into the, other liver especially gets high concentrations of it, and the spleen, all of that delivery of these inflammatory particles, starting with the mRNA within the lipid delivery system that is able to pass through membranes so effectively, and then the spike protein production, which as far as we know doesn't really stop. We now have data showing that it continues for up to 3 years, but we haven't had studies that go beyond that.
3 years from the last shot, or 3 years?
3 years from the onset of the last shot.
It's crazy.
Yeah, and that's based on case reports that are well documented. But and there's a McCullough Foundation is about to publish one of those. But the other aspect, which you alluded to, is all of the ways that it could affect the genetic mechanisms within the body, mainly through these, what Dr. McCullough refers to as the process-related impurities. And we had talked about those in the past, that the bacterial plasmid DNA contaminants that are part of the manufacturing process that were not actually part of the products that were tested in the original clinical trials, but when they shifted it over to mass production, these contaminants became extremely abundant, and billions of particles found within each vaccine that are contributing to probably to various autoimmune and, malignant situations. But we don't have good data on this yet. What we do have is some epidemiological evidence from especially Japan showing high rates of cancers corresponding to the injections, corresponding with the injections. And then we also have the SV40 found in these shots, which is SV40 has been linked with cancers. And then, as I mentioned, some of the, like, for example, inhibiting DNA repair. If you inhibit the P53 and the DNA repair mechanisms of the body, you're going to see more cancers. So this is a really multifaceted picture. And, I think it really behooves people who have had these shots to think in terms of cancer prevention, to the best of their ability. But I want to go back to something else that RFK did that I think is really important. He fired all 17 members of the CDC's vaccine advisory panel. It's a really, really bold thing. It's called the ACIP, APART stand for Committee for Immunization Practices. I'm forgetting what the A is. They'll come back to me. It's not American, but anyway. So then he installed it. There were 17 members in that committee. He fired them all because of, a well-documented history of corruption, deeply compromised by the industry since at least the year 2000. I mean, this committee, there was evidence back in 2000 that they were already deeply corrupted, but then you had across the board conflicts of interest, which you can actually see in their publications. If you looked up these individuals who were in the 17-member committee, they all had those conflicts of interest, being paid by the pharmaceutical industry directly, lack of transparency. They were often concealing information. And then I would say probably the most corruptly, if that's a word, corruptly of all. Corrupted. Yeah, is that the panel rubber stamped every single vaccine ever placed in front of them. So when that panel was established, they never rejected a single vaccine. They just allowed it to come through, regardless of the safety concerns. And those concerns were showing up in VAERS, which you and I have talked about in the past. You mentioned, I think it was in our first conversation, how, for the past 35 years, the number of adverse events in VAERS were still greater in the first 2 years of the pandemic than they had been in the previous 30 or 35 years at this point. So it's just, clear that there were safety concerns. And then there was the vSafe system, which uses a smartphone app instead of the time-consuming passive reporting system that the VAERS uses. And so they had all this data, and the ACIP committee just ignored the data. They just ignored what was coming out, which was showing these really stunning numbers of adverse events. And then they actually had the audacity to say, well, VAERS is not a great system. We can't really trust.
I used to look at VAERS once a week. They literally stopped reporting any new incidences for like at least 6 months. I watched it. It didn't change at all for 6 months. It's such a cluster. Who knows what they did?
Yeah. So he got rid of them. He installed this new 7-member panel, and it includes some well-known vaccine experts and skeptics. But it's a powerful panel because it recommends vaccines to the American public. So his reason for firing the other panel, I think it was well-founded, and the guys that he has in there now are I think a lot of them, or several of them I know are top-notch. So he did some things that were pretty radical. I mean, he suspended, I'm talking RFK again, he suspended the CDC's advertising for the flu vaccines. So he's emphasizing that we need informed consent, and it's just not there for seasonal flu vaccines. And he canceled a huge contract with Moderna that was trying to fast track a mRNA flu vaccine, a bird flu vaccine. And I think it was like a $700 million contract. It was really substantial. And
well, if an mRNA vaccine lasts for years, just like the COVID one does, then they'll be very dangerous for flu because, as we know, flu changes seasonally. That'll leave the person in a really, beleaguered state when flu comes around again. It would probably kill them. I don't think they're very.
Yeah, I mean, it's almost by definition impossible to do a good study on a lot of these flu vaccines because they do change from season to season. So they're constantly mutating, just like the coronaviruses were. So yeah, that's absolutely what you said is true. He's been asked a lot about COVID injuries, and so he's launching this big study, gold standard study of COVID vaccine injuries. And I think that's incredibly important because we haven't ever had a good government study. The studies that the CDC conducted were so egregiously flawed that they used the CDC's definition of vaccination status, which is basically use that definition in order to hide vaccine injuries. And you and I talked about that before. You're only considered vaccinated up until after the second injection, 14 days after the second injection in the primary series. So what that means is any abnormal reaction or serious reaction, including death, that happens before that, in the CDC studies, all of those were classified as unvaccinated, even though the person had received 2 shots prior to that 14-day point after the second shot. And so you you're creating a completely distorted view of adverse events. And so,
well, the reason why is, after 14 days, then it's much harder to attribute problem to the vaccination events.
right.
Oh, it's been 2 weeks. It could have been anything. Same thing happens with like personal injury cases. The longer it goes on, so you get quote unquote medical, the harder it is. That's a deliberate.
Well, I mean, yeah, but think about the implications of the fact that most of the deaths that have been recorded in the autopsy studies of people who died after the COVID-19 vaccinations, most of those deaths happen in the first 7 days, okay, after the shot. But according to the CDC,
So your car manufacturer making a 3.
right, but according to the CDC definition, those are all unvaccinated.
Right.
And
That's
that's
just like a car manufacturer giving a 3-year warranty because they know right after that's when all the problems start. It's the same thing, except in reverse.
yeah, true. Yeah. That's what else? He withdrew funding from Gavi, which is Bill Gates' group, the Global Vaccine Alliance. He withdrew U.S. funding from that, and that's
Thank God.
Yeah, that's a huge blessing. People should be celebrating in the streets about that, because he said that Gavi had neglected the key issue of vaccine safety. He basically said he said they ignored the science on vaccines. So yeah. And, he did
What is RFK doing to address? I don't know if you've heard this. Have you or any colleague? I know you don't treat patients, but have you heard anecdotes of people that are injured long term, and do they have anywhere to go? Is anyone willing to talk to them, or are they kind of put out of the medical space?
Yeah, I mean, this was actually brought up at the U.S. Senate hearing. The guy named Vaughn, Dr. Vaughn, he specializes in this issue, and the government has to create these opportunities for helping these people, and still the systems are not in place to really fully address them. There has been a certain amount of money provided to the vaccine injured, but the list is so long that we're still way behind. So the MAHA Commission has yet to fully address this. They've been kind of focused on a bunch of other things like, the water fluoridation and child chronic diseases and, things like that, overprescription of drugs, ultra processed foods, but they haven't really gotten to the issues of how to help all these vaccine injured people. And it's a colossal amount of money that would have to be doled out. I mean, you have to redirect the whole defense industry, at this point.
What are the estimates of the, number of people injured specifically by COVID vaccine?
It's millions. It's millions. I don't know. That's a good question. I think there are lots of different, depends on what categories. Like, for example, when you look at heart problems, so many of the myocarditis cases are subclinical, so they manifest as either very mild symptoms or no symptoms at all. So the only way you would know that somebody with subclinical myocarditis has the condition is you'd have to measure their troponin levels, which is this cardiac stress protein, cardiac troponins. And then you'd have to put them through, the other diagnostic tests that are required for myocarditis. So because the passive reporting system doesn't pick up so many of these cases, you don't really know who's impacted. And the same thing with like lymphomas, it may not manifest until 2 or 3 years down the road, and then it wouldn't be linked with the vaccine, And that's a general problem with the fact that, and this is a really key concept, that we know these spike proteins now persist in the body and are persistently synthesized for at least 3 years. And so knowing that, how do you make causal connections? I mean, it's very
well. How can they say that? You would think the efficacy then should be for 3 years, because supposedly the production of the spike protein is what creates the immune response and what protects the person. So why would the length of time that they're effective not be 3 years then?
The immune system response takes 2 weeks to generate sufficient antibodies. So you're raising a very important point. You're talking about efficacy versus safety. So efficacy would be what is the optimal antibody production that you see generated by the COVID shots through the spike protein production. And so the cells are generating the spike protein, the antibodies are produced in response to the spike protein, and that is considered to be to go into effect fully 2 weeks after the second shot. Okay, so in the primary series. But the problem is that those antibodies wane. The production of that protection wanes very quickly. It drops off after only three to 5 months. For older people, it's like 2 months. So the protection, that supposed theoretical protection that's provided by these shots, is very, very brief. But the harms, which is what we're talking about with the 2 to 3 years, and like I said, we have case reports now showing it's 3 years that you see the spike protein generated. Those are harms because that the spike protein that was generated 3 years ago is not generating antibodies that are neutralizing. They're not neutralizing any COVID, that any Omicron variants that are currently present, because that ship has sailed. Those Omicron variants that we have now have no bearing at all on the original shots that were given. You see what I'm saying? So it's really, the efficacy is a short-lived phenomenon, but the harms are extended because they outlive. So anytime you hear risk benefit in public health conversations about the COVID shots, they're always talking about short-term benefits. They're talking and short-term harms. They're not talking about long.
Sure, here.
Yeah.
If I get 2 shots and then they give me what's called supposedly a booster, 6 months later, I was still producing spike protein from the first 2. Now, am I producing a slightly different, altered type of spike protein, and now their production has ramped up double to what it was because the old one's still producing? Or what do you think happens with the 2?
So you're asking whether the spike protein itself changes over time with chronic.
Yeah, if I have one shot and I'm going to produce a certain kind of spike gene. 6 months later, I get supposedly so-called what's a booster, like a new variant. Will the spike protein that one produces be different from the one I'm currently producing? And will the production amount now be doubled because, I've gotten a new shot and now my body's being instructed by slightly altered mRNA to produce more spike protein of a slightly different nature, structure, form, etc. Now I would think I would have like 2 kinds being produced, maybe not double the amounts, but close to it. I don't know.
This is a complicated question in a lot of ways, because there are some issues here that are still kind of being understood. And so the spike protein itself, produced by the initial shot or whatever the last shot you had is, that spike protein is going to be the same protein produced over time. Okay. But there are other aspects to this, because you can have changes occurring and let me qualify what I just said. That would be in principle, that would be what you would expect. The problem is that you have something that you and I briefly alluded to, I think before, and that is you can have aberrant proteins produced through the frame shifting phenomenon, which is that mistranslation of the mRNA. And I don't know if that's what you're referring to, but the pseudouridine, which you and I talked about before, that is inserted in the base sequence in order to stabilize the mRNA, that pseudouridinated mRNA is going to tend to generate aberrant proteins or abnormal proteins. And those proteins are capable of forming what are called toxic prions or prion-like fibrils in neurons, and that's been shown. And so this is potentially causing a lot of neurodegenerative disorders over time. So there is we're told that this is a relatively rare event, this frame shifting. But I think that's because it was rare in the short-term time frame that they looked at it. But if you look at it over a longer time frame, like we're discussing, and maybe this is what you're getting at, this is where you would see frame shifting events happening over time, again, due to this, basically the ribosomes are not reading the mRNA correctly as it's passing through. So you get these aberrant proteins generated as a result. And that, again, could be contributing to like Alzheimer's. There's a very strong study that we cited showing that Alzheimer's disease has been accelerated by this. And we could also say the same for Parkinson's. Now, we can't say definitively that it's due to frame shifting, but the fact that we do see frame shifting, this, mistranslation of the mRNA and the production of the aberrant protein suggests that you're going to see more neurodegenerative problems such as Alzheimer's and Parkinson's. Yeah.
There's a shot they cooked up for the Omicron variant. So I get the shot. Now producing certain spike protein. But now there's a shot for this new Fauci variant, or whatever they want to call it, which is be a good name for it. How will those spike proteins look different from the ones from the Omicron version? Because my body will probably start producing both now.
Yeah. And that's a big problem because each variant that emerges is going to outsmart the previous version of the shot. When you generate the spike protein for what was a previous version, and, the vaccine industry justifies this saying, oh, we can produce these really quickly. We just have a computer, that generates what we need, and we don't even need to put it through clinical testing. We just churn it out. So just come back in and get another shot. We'll cover you. The problem is that the immunity is only lasting for a few months, and so people have to continue to come back in for the shot. So you're right. It's sort of a whack-a-mole situation. You're constantly, and I think Ryan Cole used that metaphor a few years ago. He was a pathologist who is with the Independent Medical Alliance, and he's pointed this fact out that you can't catch up with the virus because it keeps mutating. And so the Omicron elicits a spike protein, vaccine-induced spike protein that is completely different from what the Delta and Alpha variants were back in 2021. So it's really an impossible situation. You can't. It's great for the vaccine industry because they just say, well, just get another vaccine. You'll cover it. We'll cover it. But here's the other thing that's really important. We know that multiple vaccinations have cumulative adverse effects. And, we've talked about some of these, I think, briefly before, but whenever you have spike protein, and this is, I think, something else that you were getting at, if the spike proteins are being generated by multiple shots and they're persisting, and you've got multiple different types of spike protein being produced because of different variants that you're trying to attack, well, that's a serious problem because you're creating all of this antigenic exposure, antigens being a foreign protein, right, that the immune system is responding to. And so this prolonged antigenic exposure is going to result in all kinds of immune problems because the immune system can't keep up. So one of the things that happens is you get T cell exhaustion. So the T cells can only, they do their best to get rid of these antigens or, address them, but they can't keep up. And so that results in increased risk of cancer and also seems to be correlated with some other problems, some autoimmune issues. You also have the IgG4 class switch, which is a very important thing. So the IgG3 is the antibody that's typically responding, but it switches over to an IgG4 when you have this chronic antigen exposure from all this spike protein. And when that happens, you have very clear evidence of increased risk of autoimmune disease and cancers. So that, and then, we talked about inflammation. You've got inflammatory cytokines that are constantly being generated in response to them. Of course, we both know that chronic inflammation is a major driver of many diseases.
Right, and that's what the shots do, is they put you in this chronically inflamed reactive state for years at a time. And for instance, cancer is the wound that never heals. So that's how, melanoma has been described, many other cancers. But that's why in my mind, it links to it pretty closely. You're creating that.
You are, and, it's very interesting. Before I forget, there's one other piece of this that I think is fascinating, and that's the interferons that usually activate the T cells and other aspects of the immune system against cancers in particular, but also infection. So the IgG4 and the interferons, they're connected in the sense that if you get too much of that IgG4, actually makes you more susceptible to infections, autoimmune disease, and cancer. But especially in terms of the infections, this probably explains all of these studies, and I have at least a dozen of them that are published that show that the more COVID shots you get, the more COVID you develop, because you become much more vulnerable to the coronavirus infections as a result of the IgG4 and the interferons being suppressed. The interferons are really important because they're messengers that activate the T cells against infections and cancers. And so those are suppressed. And some of this appears to be an autoimmune reaction. So it's actually auto antibodies that are formed against the interferons. So it's really a mess. It's immunologically, it's kind of a headache because you get, and I sometimes refer to myself as a bioepidemiologist because I do think very biologically as I'm looking at what I see epidemiologically. And so I don't know if anybody's ever used that term, but that's the way I describe myself. And so when I look at the intersection of these, when I look at these mechanistic overlaps, like the IgG4, the interferons, the T cell exhaustion, the hyperinflammation, with the excess cytokines that are generated, and then the autoimmune reactions that are based on the, molecular mimicry, because the spike protein has some things in common with the self proteins in the body, so it sets up these autoimmune reactions. All of that, this is really an important thing that I want to share with you because I'm just finishing a paper about that. All of what I just talked about, this is the really mind-blowing piece of it. To some extent, you see it with severe COVID-19. Okay, so severe COVID-19, even before vaccination, will show to some extent all of these things. It will show T cell exhaustion. This is, very advanced COVID-19, like elderly people. You see the T cell exhaustion. You see the interferons being suppressed. You see I'm not so sure if you see I don't think you see the IgG4, but you do see the hyperinflammation and the autoimmune thing. So all of that is happening with severe COVID-19. Okay. So it also makes sense that in severe COVID-19, you would see many conditions that are considered comorbid. In other words, they make the COVID-19 more aggressive, like hypertension, diabetes, obesity. People who have hypertension, diabetes, and obesity, or some combination of that, are much more prone to severe COVID-19. And back in 2020, it was, if somebody died of diabetes and they had a positive PCR, it was called a COVID death, right? You remember that. Now, if you think about these comorbid conditions, it turns out that hypertension, diabetes, and obesity, and I list them in that order because that's the way it actually translates into the most severe conditions with COVID-19. If you have those conditions, you also suffer from the serious adverse effects of the COVID vaccinations, much more so, okay? So this is an interesting intersection, and this is why it's so easy to blame severe COVID-19 when somebody dies from one of these conditions that looks like, temporally, it looks like it was caused by the severe COVID-19. But if you look back at the person's vaccination record, you find out that they were vaccinated heavily, and yet it's blamed on the COVID-19 because it's so much easier to blame it on severe COVID-19 than to blame it on the COVID mRNA injections.
Yeah.
You see? And
it makes sense. I mean, each condition is a tax on the regulatory systems of the body, including the immune system. So hypertension, there's compensatory mechanisms going on. Diabetes, same thing. I mean, obesity, same thing. So if you layer this in, you're finished.
Both hypertension and diabetes involve rapid aging of the immune system. And I believe obesity also has that. And then if you add age on top of it, you have inflammation. So yeah, it's one big, I don't want to cuss, but it's a shitstorm. And it's a really, really serious issue because, right now, think about this. The COVID injections, mRNA injections, are actually the reason that so many people are still getting serious COVID-19 from Omicron, which is basically like the common cold if you did not get the vaccination. But if you did get the vaccination, Omicron now has a much higher risk of becoming severe COVID-19. And that's the paper that I'm writing. right now. I have a hypothesis, and I call initially I called it triple hit hypothesis because it involved having the 2 shots, at a minimum of 2 shots of the vaccine, followed by the infection. So that would be a triple hit. Then I changed it to the superimposition hypothesis because we're superimposing the infection on the vaccination history, right? But my most recent, you're going to like this, I think. I just changed I haven't submitted this yet. But I changed the hypothesis to the hybrid harms hypothesis. Because hybrid immunity, and this goes back to your question about efficacy, because this is very interesting. Hybrid immunity has been used by the vaccine industry to tout the benefits of the COVID shots, because they say, hey, if you got infected before and now you get the shot, you have super immunity. You're actually more immune than somebody who just got the infection. So you've got super immunity, and they call that hybrid immunity, okay? But the problem is that those high antibody levels are directly correlated with the serious adverse effects of the COVID shots. So hybrid immunity actually, even though it appears to give short-term protection against the coronavirus infection, it translates into much more serious adverse impacts.
Yeah, because the mechanism of action is totally different. A normal immunological response is a response, but it doesn't put the body in a state where there's continual irritation, some production of spike proteins, for instance, where it causes all kinds of sequelae, but this does. So the whole thing is everything is just being covered up with semantics to get as much of this into these people as possible.
And you think about, the fact that the infection fatality rate was so incredibly low, right, with COVID. So why would you need to have super immunity against something that is, for the vast majority of the population, a relatively harmless pathogen? You don't, so saying super immunity is just like, it's hype. It's pure hype. And it has no bearing on biological reality. So yeah, I think you absolutely get it. And it's, I'll just say one last thing about you and I talked before about the smallpox vaccine, and I made a big mistake in our previous interview.
Oh, what do you mean?
I mistakenly said in our last interview with that the smallpox vaccine was a vaccine success story, but I was totally wrong. I had been brainwashed by the propaganda, mainly from the vaccine industry, of course, about smallpox, and I never bothered to really investigate what actually happened with the research on the smallpox vaccine. But it turns out when you look at the research that this vaccine has caused, in the research itself, thousands and thousands of deaths. And the U.S. military data is actually the best data that confirms this. At least tens of thousands of deaths were caused in the observational studies that were done of the smallpox vaccine. So it was a disaster that ended up killing many people, and this has been completely whitewashed by the vaccine industry. But the smallpox, the only reason it went away was because of public health sanitation measures. Sorry, did you hear that? Is that a loud bang?
No.
Okay.
No, I didn't hear it.
Okay, good.
There's also a book on polio that seems to allege similar issues. Is the moth and I'll have to get the name.
Yes, but
yeah, the moth and the iron lung. Excellent book, talks about polio and what they think maybe the actual real source of it was.
Yeah, and the reason I bring that up is, Rich, because when they removed the COVID shots from the childhood vaccine schedule, which, by the way, I celebrated wholeheartedly, I thought it was a huge public health move. It helps shift the attention to the non-vaccine preventive measures, such as, public health measures.
There is no such thing. Sorry. I was just repeating the propaganda.
Public health measures to, reduce rates of childhood obesity, for example, and childhood diabetes. Both of those increase the risks of severe COVID, right? So if you have healthy kids, you don't have severe COVID and you don't have death from COVID. You have to address these things. And so it helps shift the attention over, just like with smallpox vaccine, when they shift the attention to the public sanitation issues, then you see smallpox go away. But the other thing is that there are legal implications of taking it off the childhood vaccine schedule.
Oh, really?
Yeah. I mean, families can pursue damages through lawsuits against the manufacturers, but I don't think they can do it for kids under 11 because of the emergency use authorization. I'm not totally sure of this aspect. I have to check that. They could do it for teenagers, and because there's the National Childhood Vaccine Injury Act of 1986, which through the Vaccine Injury Compensation Program, it would help compensate injuries. But if the vaccine, anyway, this is getting into a legal area, but I know that the legal action could also target the regulatory bodies themselves, so this is actually could lead to class action lawsuits. And I think that's, something that could be beneficial in terms of, helping to get some restitution for all the damages. Yeah. You mentioned something briefly. I'll just say that the CDC study that came out recently that Kennedy exposed, there was a huge CDC study. They found 1,135% increased risk of autism among vaccinated children.
From which vaccine? From the COVID one or other ones?
Oh, no, this is from the typical vaccines that kids were receiving, like the MMR, pertussis. So the CDC tried to distort the study's findings. This was like 15 years ago, I think, or 20 years ago. And this was in a Tucker Carlson interview that he did with RFK last week. And it's explosive, because here what happened was the CDC tried to hide it by using all these statistical tricks. And then when they reanalyzed the original data and put it through the proper analysis, it showed this devastating finding, over 1,100% increase in the risk of autism among kids who got the multiple vaccines. So this is really, I think, devastating, and it supports, why we need to do more research in this area and get these kids off of all these shots.
Well, my words, not yours, but I think COVID was the greatest crime against humanity ever perpetrated. Again, that's what I think. So I appreciate you being here. How can people follow up with your work, the McCullough Foundation and everything?
Right. So you can follow our work, my work on X. I think it's Nathan Mead, and this McCullough Fund on X. McCullough Fund is the foundation. Or you can go to the McCulloughFND.org website. So that's the McCullough Fund website, McCullough F as in Frank, N as in Nancy, D as in David.org. And it's a really good website, and you'll find all our articles and social media links there. We're also on LinkedIn and Telegram.
Well, very good. Well, Nathaniel, thanks so much for coming on the podcast again. You're welcome to come back anytime. And it's always very informative talking to you. It's also maddening, saddening, all those things, because, it's a travesty that's beyond all measure. But again, thank you for coming here and talking about this.
Well, thanks very much, Rich. It's been a pleasure. I appreciate it. Thank you.
If you like this podcast, please click the link in the description to subscribe and review us on iTunes.
You've been listening to the Finding Genius podcast with Richard Jacobs. If you like what you hear, be sure to review and subscribe to the Finding Genius podcast on iTunes or wherever you listen to podcasts. And want to be smarter than everybody else? Become a premium member at findinggeniuspodcast.com. This podcast is for information only. No advice of any kind is being given. Any action you take or don't take as a result of listening is your sole responsibility. Consult professionals when advice is needed.